Well, one of my favorites is Van Gogh's Starry Night, which I'll probably talk about in a few weeks.
Yes, Vincent.
And but for tonight, on the screen right here, you have a painting. And this style is still life. Now, still life is normally things like flowers or fruit. That's kind of the normal thing. This one is a bit unusual. And I'm going to tell you the story a bit about this still life painting. It'll make sense as we go along. But there on the left side of the painting, what you actually find is a pewter container for pouring water. Now, this is my Texas accent, but a flagon. And if you ever wondered what one of those was, that's what it was. It's for pouring water. And in the middle is a kind of drinking vessel. Specifically, it was a Dutch drinking vessel, mainly for toasting. But again, we'll come back to that in a minute. This painting here was painted in 1614 in the Netherlands, and the painter was Dutch. That kind of toasting glass specifically was called a romer, and specifically for toasting and specifically for drinking wine. Now, that's all important because if you look a little closer, all right.
It does remind me of the autopsy.
The what?
The autopsy, which is a picture of an autopsy.
Okay.
It's just the detail of it and the feel of it. But yeah, okay, it's still life. But well, you need to tell me the who painted it. But
oh yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there. Well, if you notice the romer, first of all, you'll notice what's in it. Water. It's half full of water. There's no wine in it. But on the other side of it is a wine jug.
Wine flask.
All right. And the spout of the flagon is turned away from the romer, if you notice that, which carries the water. But the lid of the wine jug is situated facing toward the romer. And we're going to come back to that here in a minute. But if you look above it...
It's like a bridle, a bit.
Yeah, good eye. There's a bridle.
Very vicious bit. Gosh.
Yeah.
An object you wouldn't necessarily see with these other items. So if you looked at all the items in this picture, you would look at the bridle and go, what's the item that doesn't belong in this picture?
Why is it here? Yeah.
And of course, a horse bridle, you said, goes in the horse's mouth, hook the reins to control the horse. And the question is, why is it above the romer? But that's not all. Underneath, hanging down, underneath the romer, you find hanging down over a little shelf or the side of the table is a 17th century musical notation with lyrics written in old-fashioned Dutch. Now, I don't speak Dutch, but I can tell you what it means. It means, what outside of measure exists in unmeasured evil perishes. What outside of measure exists in unmeasured evil perishes, which helps us understand what this painting is about. And this painting, as I said, is a still life painting, but specifically it's emblematic still life is what the category is, which means it has purpose to it, specifically to represent something moral or religious or a philosophical or a psychological idea to teach a certain point or to show a certain point. And this one is about temperance, which I'll explain as we come around to it. Now, temperance, the virtue of temperance, is our second virtue, which is not a very popular topic, but our series itself about virtue is specifically, as we said, about self-examination. And that's important because as we go through each topic, we can take each topic alone, and that can be dangerous, but we can take the topic and then go, what I've learned or what I'm hearing, I'm going to apply to that person and this person or this part of the culture. But really it's about, how does this apply to me? So I quoted last week from Psalm 26:2. Today I'm quoting from Psalm 139, which is one of my favorite chapters. where the psalmist David, he writes, "Search me and know me, test my anxious thoughts, see if there's any offensive way inside of me, and lead me in the way everlasting." So that's really what this series is all about, is coming before God, looking at these things and saying, God, where in me I may be failing? Where can I rise up? And in the ancient world, as we said last week as well, our ancient Christian brothers and sisters, philosophers, poets, prophets, priests, wise people of old, they were all discussing virtue a long time ago. What does it consist of? Can it be taught? Is it one thing or is it many things? And it was discovered that virtue is one thing, but it can be broken down into several parts. And one of the examples we use is like the visible light. From the ceiling right now, we see visible light. But once it hits a prism, we see that it's broken down into its many parts. So virtue as well has 7 parts, just like the color spectrum. And so we named our series The Virtuous Seven. And one of the reasons why is just like the Magnificent Seven, the great group of cowboys. Them together, they created a magnificent team. But the virtues themselves, especially the first 4, become very dangerous when they're left to their own. Justice can be very dangerous when all we're doing is, as we said last week, loving justice. If we fall in love with justice and feel like we're on intimate terms with justice, it becomes a very dangerous thing. And so justice, temperance, prudence, and fortitude are the first 4. And these are the ancient 4. They were around in the world before Christianity. They were already, you might say, pre-packaged and ready to go. And they were known in antiquity as the cardinal virtues. And we've heard the word cardinal before. And the word cardinal doesn't mean a guy in red wearing a fancy hat. It doesn't mean the beautiful bird that flutters around. But the word cardinal is the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. Specifically, we would say it means hingy. That these are hingy virtues. That everything, basically, in life hinges on these 4 virtues. But Christians came around and said, you know what? These are good. We wholeheartedly endorse these 4 virtues. You can't get anywhere without them. But we know about 3 more. Jesus taught about the first 4, but Jesus added more. And these 3 are called the theological virtues. Or, as we also said last week, the first 4 are called the rational virtues, because you can get to them by rationale. But the last 3 are also deemed the irrational virtues, not because they're silly or ridiculous, but because you can't get to them by rationale alone. They're divinely or supernatural inspired. And that's one of the other terms for the 3 is the supernatural virtues. And so last week we talked about justice, and we asked the most basic question, which was, what does this person deserve? And justice, the virtue of justice, is about deserve. Justice is giving people what they deserve and asking the question, what do I owe them? So we said, like in Romans 13:7, Paul writes and says, if you owe somebody taxes, give them their taxes. If you owe them revenue, give them revenue. If it's respect, respect. If it's honor, honor. He's talking about justice. So we said, if you know you owe somebody 5 pounds, justice is giving them 5 pounds. It's not giving them 2 pounds, and it's not giving them 7 pounds. It is giving them the 5 pounds. The question of how much does this person deserve? How much do I owe? How much should I give? And so last week we talked about how, especially when we talk about the virtue of justice, both social scientists and animal behaviorists said, through lots of study and discussion, that there is a universal basis across every culture of common morality. And this is a really good thing. And that's really important because it's worthwhile to understand that morality isn't simply arbitrary. It's hardwired into our DNA. And if we put it this way, the book of Ecclesiastes says that he has put eternity into man's hearts. When God created this planet, it's not that man created these 4 virtues, justice, temperance, and so forth. They discovered them. Just like Newton did not create gravity, but simply discovered it. Right? So that's important to understand, that these are things that God gave us. They are in the world. And so as we progress through this, science has a real problem when it comes to virtue. You can't learn about virtue from a scientist because science can tell us where morality might come from. Science can tell us what shape it is. Science can tell us, or it can't tell us why we should do it. And this is where we get held up, especially in our Western culture, because a lot of the questions is, show me the proof, show me the evidence. But the problem with virtue is science can't do that. And there's actually a scientific term for this. It's called Hume's Law, from David Hume, the great philosopher, who was the first person to notice this. And what he taught is basically paraphrased as this, is you can't get a should from an is. You can't get a should from an is.
Is. Sorry.
Yeah, don't worry. No worries. Virtue tells us the should. Justice begins to ask the question of should toward other people. What should I give them in return? What do I owe them? And it's foundational, it's fair, it's what they deserve. But our next move in virtue is about our obligation to ourselves. What should I do with regard to myself? What does myself owe myself, might be the question. And it's a weird question because the moment we notice that question, we're on the road to temperance. This is a good place to be. Because you can almost think of justice and temperance like two sides of a coin. And it's very important. There's a sense in which temperance is simply justice turned inward. And there's a sense in which justice is simply temperance turned outward. And it's not precise. They really are two separate things, roughly speaking. But there is correspondence between them. And so one of the situations we can look at in Scripture is Acts chapter 24. And in the story, we see that Paul's in prison. He's in Caesarea. He's going to be tried before the local tribune. And he's held in the palace of Governor Felix. And this is interesting because historically, Governor Felix, which this is just a cool thing to know about him, is there's some, you might say you might get a kind of gladiator movie feel to this, but he was a freed slave. And he was risen by his abilities to a very high position. So a bit of gladiator reverse, you might say. But it doesn't mean he was a good man. He was just a skilled politician, Governor Felix. Okay? So people had respect for him because of what he had done with his life. But he was well known for two things. He was easy to bribe, and he loved living a life of excess. He loved women, he loved wine, and he loved lots of song. And he governed the area for a while, and he was very acquainted with Christianity. He wasn't a Christian by any means, but he was acquainted with what the locals believed. And so there came a time that he wanted to hear about this strange new belief from a person, from one of its own teachers. And they were like, well, there's Paul, he's in your prison, he can tell you all about it. So Felix, with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, they sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Jesus. But it wasn't what he was expecting. But as he reasoned, Paul reasoned about righteousness and self-control. And as we read these two words in the New Testament English, we're like, those are very Bible-y, Christian-y words. And Paul talks also about the coming judgment. It says that Felix was alarmed and he went away for the present. And he tells Paul, when I get an opportunity, I'm going to summon you. This is interesting because in the English translation, these two words here, righteousness and self-control, the word righteousness is dikasune, and the word self-control is enkratia. And enkratia is the word I want you to say with me tonight. Enkratia. Yeah. Another way to put this is, if you really want to understand it, is that what Paul was doing was reasoning with Felix on his own ground of understanding. Felix knew about these two words and what they meant. He wasn't talking about Christianese words. What Paul was doing was talking to him about virtue. Righteousness was about justice. And enkratia was about temperance. We translate it as self-control. And so he's coming to Felix on his own moral belief system. He's literally saying, Felix, you know these things. This is what you believe. He's teaching him what he already knew from Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. This is good evangelism here. He's teaching him what he knows, what he already believes, and then he's bringing it along to tell him, okay, now let's apply this to Jesus. And what Paul is saying is he says to him, he says, Felix, you stand condemned and in need of salvation according to what you already believe. I don't even have to bring up anything new. According to your own moral belief system, you have already condemned yourself. And this is why Felix is alarmed, because it's inescapable. His own moral code has condemned him. Paul literally brought him into his own trap. It's just a beautiful thing that's going on here. And there's two, as we said, there's two well-known things here, is that he takes bribes, and he lives a life of excess. He takes bribes, that's justice, and he lives a life of excess, which is temperance.
Intemperance.
Yeah, intemperance, that's right. And these were a problem for him. And so, as we go any further, we got to kind of be on the same page of really what temperance is. Because the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define temperance. So we're all on the same page. Because temperance is not used as a word very often in our culture, because it occupies a weird place in our histories, especially American history, but some in English history as well. But it's very, very much why English Bible translators are very reluctant to use the word temperance and will shift more toward the word self-control. Now, the Greek word we're here is that word enkratia, because there's a compound word in krat or kratos, and kratos carries the idea, first of all, of strength, force, and by the extension, the idea of power over something. So dominion and control. And the in part, well, it's just what it sounds. It's inner control, inner dominion, inner strength, inner force. And so the idea is control over one's appetites and impulses. And so that's why modern translators use the word self-control. So there's a little fun fact for you. So if you want to write that in your Bible later, so you see it. So it's about control over yourself when you want something so you don't have more than what might be good. And in the U.S. we have there's Walkers here. It looks the same exact bag in the U.S., but it's Lay's potato chips. And their motto is literally, you can't have just one. And so this is the idea of temperance is, can I have just one? Should I have just one? Is it okay to have more than one? Is it okay to have 10? How much is how much? Does the serving size on the back say 20 is a serving size? Should I have 20? What is the right amount? So as we get in temperance, this is one of the questions. Temperance enables you to control yourself with inward control and not go beyond that. So,
yeah, Walker's crisp. Don't buy the big bags, buy the small bags. More waste, but gets you to stop once the bag is empty.
Well, until you just take out all 6.
Well, yeah.
Maybe buy just one little bag.
But it makes you think.
It's gone.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's actually, yeah, I do find that myself. So you buy the big bag, which is a little bit cheaper, but you don't stop until the bag is empty.
Yeah.
It's expected. Yeah.
You know, everything that says family size is really just one person's size. We all know that. Yeah. So back to the painting, we have the bridle. We already said what it's for. It's for controlling the horse. And so the mental image is as your impulses are like an animal you are riding. And temperance is you bridling your impulses and being in control of them instead of the other way around. Because you choose to. You direct your impulses, not your impulses direct you. And so the flagon, as we said, is turned away from the roamer because it's already poured in some water. We're done with that. It went first, it's set aside. The wine jug is ready to be poured in because it can fill the rest of the glass full of wine. And the idea is you're going to mix the water and the wine because it will make the wine less intoxicating and also quench your thirst. But pour the water first so you know you've left room for it. So understanding that as we go back to American history, specifically to about the 1820s, and we have to realize is that there was a problem with drunkenness, not like a drunken problem like we have today. It was much, much, much worse. And they were noticing it as well in England at this time as well. It was getting quite bad. And back to those social scientists who study these things, they believe it was primarily because people lost their community and they lost their family because of two factors. In this time period, there was industrialization and there was urbanization. People were losing their support structures. People were moving away from family. People were moving into city centers. People also were having more free time than ever. Suddenly there was more things to do the jobs for you. And you didn't have to do, let's say, spend all day working the manual labor on the farm. You had a job, you went to the job, you came home. And because of these two things, they found that people were depressed and there was no support, so they turned to alcohol. And it was readily available. It was like faucets coming out of the wall. And in the 1830s, they decided you have to get control of this. And it got messy, but part of the understanding is that it was literally killing masses of people. It was ruining families and destroying lives on an epidemic scale. So out of this was born the temperance movement. And at first, their message was be temperate of usage. Be temperate of usage. But being temperate was hard because being intemperate is very easy. I do what I want. I have as much as I want. We know what it's like. We're in the U.S. we have Thanksgiving Day. It's the day to enjoy and eat what you want, and then you fall asleep for a nap. Or you see that cake at home, and you're like, well, it's just going to go bad if I don't finish it. Intemperance is easy. So little by little, the movement pushed, and they went a little bit further. And they said, well, just don't drink distilled spirits. Just wine. But that didn't work because people started with beer and wine and then always went on to the harder stuff. So that didn't work. So they said, well, let's make it illegal. And this went and led into the 13 long year experiment with prohibition in the U.S. And so that didn't go very well, or as well as they had hoped to be. So the word temperance at that point in Western culture became directly connected with meaning total abstinence. Not about how much, it got connected with none. And for your pleasure, I have a song from the Temperance movement just for you to listen to a little bit of in case you want to get some more beverage for just a moment.
We're coming our way, back on the right side of temperance. We do take our stand. We don't use tobacco because we think that people who use it are likely to drink. And away with rum by gum, away with rum by gum. The song of never eat cookies because they have yeast. One little bite turns a man to a beast. Can you imagine?
So that's on YouTube if you want to listen to the many renditions of it later on. And they go through several different varieties of things that you should avoid, get rid of. But you can imagine them gathering around in the square, singing the song together and trying to rally people to... And so it has good heart behind it, as things often do. But as we know, simply prohibiting something doesn't always exactly just help. People find a way around it. It always still exists. Or they find new ways to do the thing that you wanted them to avoid anyway.
So you're saying the temperance movement wasn't temperate in how it's trying to achieve?
That is true as well. But that does seem, the more we push, the more the pendulum moves. But that's, of course, not what it means. That's not to say, though, the question, too, of how much you should have is the answer may be none at all.
Yeah.
All right? So when you talk about temperance, the answer might be, I shouldn't have any at all. That doesn't mean that temperance means none at all, but for you at times, it might mean none at all. But the Bible does say very clearly, and we have to be clear on this issue, that it's in the New Testament, it's in the Old Testament, and one of the wisdom, of course, Proverbs 23:20, be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them in rags. And we see in the New Testament, of course, that we're told not to get drunk on wine, and so we have that there. See? And there's many of those texts, and if you can't go without finding yourself drunk, the answer is none. You should stop. And that's a hard thing, because being intemperate is easy, especially when we become addicted to whatever it is. So, but it's also for other things that we must be temperate about. Temperance is actually about all of our impulses and all of our appetites, just in case you're like, oh, it's only about alcohol. It's not. It's about everything across the board. And this is a good definition. So if you want to write this down, this is good. Temperance is voluntary, appropriate, self-restraint in the use of created things. It is voluntary, appropriate, self-restraint in the use of created things. What that means is voluntary. Nobody's making you do it. Appropriate is not going crazy with it. Self-restraint in the use of created things. Not just food and drink, everything that you might have an impulse toward. It might mean that you have an addiction to backpacks and you can't get enough of backpacks or hats, and you just are intemperate with hats. And whatever it is, the second thing that we have to do is describe temperance. And temperance can be a hard thing to get our head around, because the question is, how much should I? Temperance looks different in different circumstances. It's not a question of like we see when I say drunkenness, okay, we should not do that. But temperance is that middle area where we need to look at ourselves, examine ourselves, and go, how much should I have in this moment, in this circumstances? What's appropriate? And so Paul talks about this, and this is the exact situation that Paul is teaching to the Corinthians, because to the Corinthians, when he's writing to them, it's a huge problem for them, because the Corinthians were people of excess. And when they came into the church, when they came to Christ, they brought that with them. And so one of the situations we see is one of the teachings on the Lord's Supper. And a side note here is that in the book of Acts, and when we see the Lord's Supper looks nothing like the way we do it in church. It's a total different thing. So we have to get that around our picture, because the way they did it and the way it's in the Bible is not quite the way that we do it today. And so when they got together, they were eating the Lord's Supper. They were eating together. There was food, there was wine, there was bread. And Paul calls upon them and it says, the Lord's Supper is not the supper you eat. But each one goes ahead. One goes hungry, another one is drunk. One gorges on bread, one gets none. So temperance was needed. And so he goes on also in the book of Corinthians, and he speaks about marriage. And he speaks about unmarried widows, that it's good for them to remain single. But if they can't exercise self-control, get married rather than burn with passion. This is in kratia that he's talking about. Being single requires temperance. And there's a sidebar here that's important to note, because when we talk about temperance, there's so much about temperance that is misused. And it's good to clarify that this verse is often misused to say that being married or being unmarried is a more holy status. And that's untrue. Okay? That being unmarried, when Paul's referencing this, is more holy than being married. Devoting your whole life in service to Jesus is good. It's a good thing. But it's not commanded. But a wife and kids takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And what he's saying is you need to be temperate. So if you truly want to give your whole life in service to Jesus, well, you have to consider this. Because what does happen, and this is a real problem, is that people who become ministers or pastors or whatever that have wife and kids, what they might do is then neglect their wife and kids for the sake of the ministry, which is a very bad thing to do. Or the other way around. Yeah. And we literally have a term in Western culture for this, and we call them preacher's kids. And there's this expectation that preacher kids are going to be the worst kids in church. And this is one of the things why, is because for a lot of the, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, that it was almost taught, especially in American Bible colleges, not to take care of your family, but that the ministry always comes first. And it was okay to neglect your wife and kids. It wasn't said this way, but this is the way it was practiced, and it caused a lot of damage. And we have to understand there's a temperance here. And so Paul is talking about temperance here, and we have to say that it's not more holy or moral than being married. It's not a debate like being single is more holy or being married is more holy. Paul's saying you just got to be temperate and wise. If you're giving your life to Jesus and you want to be in full service of him, then you need to make a decision. Would having a wife and a kids take away from that? What do I want to do here? And so in God's eyes, in fact, it's important to know that marriage is actually called good and holy in Scripture many times. And marriage is a symbol of the relationship between God and man, his people. And so it's a holy thing. And so to then say, well, you should not get holy because it is a lesser holiness, that is very wrong to do. It is very wrong to do. What he's talking about is bridling your sexuality. And if you can't, get married. He's not saying that, well, you can't bridle sexuality. You've kind of failed. You can't serve Jesus as much. Go get married. He's not doing that. But sometimes that's the way it's been taught. And sometimes the answer to the question of how much is none, like we said. But sometimes it's none right now, but maybe sometime later at the right time under the right circumstances. And as you talk about temperance, it can sound sometimes a bit dreadful. Like you might have things in your mind going, oh, I'm a bit intemperate with that. That's probably not too great. And you begin thinking, I don't know how I can maybe... We were thinking, well, the thing that's in all of our heads sometimes, well, I could probably cut out the sugar and maybe exercise more, but I can just never get my gumption to do it. Well, it's good to know that in Galatians 5, in the fruit of the Spirit, enkratia is one of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and enkratia, self-control. That means if we commit to Jesus, the Holy Spirit provides supernatural help to cultivate the virtue of temperance because it's hard. And so, as we are here, we're only up the ladder 2 virtues already. And it can get pretty difficult because there's new things for each generation of what has to be temperate about. And so if we look at the painting again, there you'll notice there's something there that we kind of forgot, or we haven't forgot, but we just haven't gone to yet. And that is, what's there?
2 pipes.
2 pipes, that's right. There's pipes there, and this is really important because clay pipes for tobacco, because tobacco had only been in Europe for 55 years at this point when this painting was painted. It was a new thing. The Bible doesn't talk about tobacco. But they had figured it out by this time that it was tempting people into intemperance. So much so that tobacco took Holland by storm during this time period. And by storm, I mean by storm because like storm clouds rolled in, the clouds of tobacco smoke rolled in. Every private home, every ale house, every public building were just clouds of smoke pouring out. Everybody was smoking, and the painter recognized this too. But the pipes here, in fact, are upside down because we have to learn to be temperate about new things. And so at one point in history, there was even a struggle, if you might believe it, to be temperate in how much you read novels. The desire to read novels. because there was a craze for novel reading. Novel itself comes from the word that means new. Yeah, so at one point novels were new, and there was a intemperate amount of novel reading. It was ruining people's lives. There were people who said reading novels is going to bring down our civilization. It was a new thing. It wasn't under control because there had never been novels before. The same thing also happened. People were just eating them up. But the same thing also happened when certain dances became popular. When the waltz, people were waltzing their brains out and couldn't stop. And it was causing, there were people going around. This is going to be the downfall of our civilization. The same thing with the Charleston and the jitterbug. Everything can be tempting. And so when it came to the 1940s and 50s, there was a new thing that began to enter the home, the television. That's right. How much should we watch? And that was a real question. And the networks answered and said, everything. You should watch everything. And in our generation, we might say it could be, or it has been the last 10 or 15 years, social media. How do we be temperate with social media? And our smartphones. And there's whole new things that we're finding, certain neck issues that are popping up that people haven't commonly had because we're going this the whole way and getting these new headaches. And tomorrow it's going to be a whole new thing. How much? And so we can go back to Scripture and see what God says is harmful and destructive straight out and avoid it. But other times, it's also seeing what's not overtly evil and wrong, but in excess it is. And when I was young, I would consume the Bible as a kid. I was a church kid. And I had went to Sunday school every Sunday. And when I was growing up, they worked through Sunday school material from Standard Publishing, is what it was called. And so every year you went through all the high point Bible stories. And I had read my 1984 New International Version Bible cover to cover, which I might have shared last week. But what I had discovered is that there was this thing that I had learned in growing up in church that was a sin, but I never found it in the Bible. And I was shocked to find out that I couldn't find the word gambling in the Bible. But when I did see circumstances about people were kind of gambling, it was actually the disciples in the book of Acts trying to figure out who was going to become the next disciple. And they tossed things to find out an answer from God. And so we see things about debt, but you have something to say?
Well, they drew lots, didn't they, at the foot of the cross?
They did. They drew lots at the foot of the cross. But then, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But then the disciples did the same thing to choose who was going to be the next 12th disciple. So we find this unusual thing going on in Scripture. But it falls into the realm of temperance. And we say, well, and I remember asking my mother, so why is gambling wrong? She says, because it ruins people's lives. And what it is, it's a form of intemperance, something that's easily addictive that becomes an act of intemperance. And so how do we bridle that horse is the question, and that's our third point there, developing temperance. A lot of what we feel unease about in our culture is a result of systematic intemperance, things that make us feel concern about a lot of times in our culture. You see, 300 years before Jesus, the philosopher Aristotle wrote, "Men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So, too, we become just by doing just acts, temperance by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts." But how do we know what constitutes temperance? The should question isn't always obvious. Sometimes we want that answer. Sometimes we like that justice answer in the Bible, where the Bible gives us a kind of a clear line and says, okay, this is wrong, don't do this. But it doesn't always do that. And so we have this long history of Christian forefathers that continually are wrestling in each new generation of what should we do with this thing? What is temperate? And this is what's so important about the virtue of temperance, and also what we so lose and have lost so often in our cultures of asking that question. And we do teach about self-control, but it goes a little bit further. You see, without prudence, it can get dangerous very quickly because it can be a bit like blind shooting in the dark.
Yeah. the thing with all of that is always, if you look at what's happening with social media, basically trying to prescribe and make it enshrine it in law of what people should or shouldn't do, or the social media should or shouldn't do certain things, and it's misunderstood. Looking at the prohibition, it was prescribing you shouldn't, but it didn't work either.
Yeah.
It doesn't work if it's completely allowed. It doesn't work if it's completely disallowed. It's finding that. With justice, I always find sometimes speak to people in the street about that. In terms of finding justice is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people, you won't find justice in the justice system because it's the interpretation of the law is the problem, and if you're trying to prescribe everything, you're going to interpret the letter of the law, but what was meant by this law? What's the spirit of the law?
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of sometimes when you look at also when you describe the Old and the New Testament. Well, the Old Testament is very prescriptive. You shouldn't do. It gives you the 10 Commandments and 600 more from the Pharisees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But Jesus was telling you just got it wrong because you just didn't understand the spirit of the law. And then when the Pharisee asks him, what is the most important law? Well, love your God and love your neighbor. Everything else flows from that. And so, letter of the law and spirit of the law is something which I find is occurring. And you see that, and I know with temperance, so how much should you forbid the social media for under 16 or 18 years old? No, it's going to be stupid. It's not going to help because it's going to be forbidden fruit. So it's actually what you just said. So we should talk about how much should we allow people to use social media, or how much we should teach the children. Yes, use the social media, but use it in a positive way, not in a.
I think it's not just social media, but anything.
Yeah.
And everybody, not youngsters, but everybody is. It's learning the consequences, or weighing up the consequences,
And
and
understanding.
balancing. Like you say, can I have one crisp, or can I have one packet? Can I have one packet of 6 packets? It's thinking of the consequence of your actions, or
And living with the consequences.
and living with those consequences. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and balancing it.
Yeah, it's in German. There's also alcohol also, and drink in mass. Drink in mass and not en masse. It's sort of because it sort of alliterates rhymes in German. So drink a mass is obviously your beer mass and your Oktoberfest, and it's called a mass because it's a measured amount of volume of drink, like a pint. It's a pint means a specific amount of volume. So have 1 pint, drink 1 mass, but don't drink in masses.
Yes.
Yeah. It's the excess, the overindulgence.
Yeah.
Alcohol isn't bad. Obviously, Jesus was drinking wine with the disciples, but they didn't do it to get drunk or overly jolly,
Well, I suppose it's probably a bit like, wherever in the sort of Middle Ages and things, the water was so contaminated
which
that it
was
safer,
another, which
safer
was another
to
reason,
drink
yes.
beer or wine
Mhm.
because,
It was,
They didn't know at the time, but they knew that if you
yeah.
made it, then it was safe.
It
Same
was
thing with
or safer. to
Yeah,
drink.
safer. They didn't know about the boiling of
Yes.
the germs out of it yet,
Yeah,
but that's
no,
what's
yeah.
happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's something for the week as we're developing temperance. Paul again talked to the Corinthians, and at the time, especially the Corinthian Christians, they liked to quote a little saying every time that they began to do something that was against the Jewish law. Kind of snarky, you might say. All things are lawful to me. So, and that's true. Christ died and fulfilled the law and put it away. So all things are lawful to me. And they you could picture them kind of grinning when they said this, and then they do what they want to. And Paul writes to them and says, all things are lawful to me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful to me, but I will not be dominated by anything. He's talking about temperance. And he's given them a couple guidelines on temperance, kind of a rough rule. Lawful isn't the only criteria. And there's some things that the reason you shouldn't do it isn't because there's no Old Testament law or not, but because it's not good for you. And that's a whole different category. And it might not be good for your physical health. It might not be good for your mental health. It might not be good for your long-term health, for your household finances, but whatever, we would say nowadays that it's not helping anything. And so you could try this for a moment. Can you think, and you don't have to say it out loud, just to yourself, can you think of something in your own life by your own standard, and not talking about some standard that I impose on you or anybody else, something by your own standard that you can think of something to a degree or at all that isn't helpful in your life. Something that's just making things worse. Something that you're being controlled by your impulses instead of the other way around. And Paul says, in fact, that there are some things that you shouldn't do because if you do, they take control of you. All things are lawful, but I will not be dominated by anything. And there's things that can master us, things that can dominate us. As Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. So, what else is Lord in your life? What is dominating? And it can be really anything. Like we said, it could be coffee. It could be sugar. And there's a phrase that's very common in English culture, and it's even on jokes, it's on cards, it's on t-shirts. We put it on coffee mugs. Things that say something like, don't talk to me until I've had my first cup of coffee so I don't have to kill you. But the problem is if coffee has such a grip to us in the extent that we can't be considerate to other people who deserve justice, our consideration, you might be a little intemperate in your use of caffeine. Or we can be intemperate about, maybe if we're grumpy in the morning, maybe it's about the time we go to bed. And so our time awake might be a bit too intemperate. Maybe we get kind of addicted to, again, the social media and scrolling at nighttime and kind of lose track and it becomes a blur. And so we're going to go back to that painting one more time. And it's kind of interesting because I want to tell you about the painting. And the artist himself went by the name of Johannes Terentius. And in his day, he was the literal master of still life painting. Nobody could beat him. All the other painters wanted to beat him to the point that he was painting in secret in an attic to keep his aloft. Not as an addict, in case my accent got you. Yeah, so aloft. To keep his techniques and his paint secrets a secret. And in fact, even today, historians aren't even 100% sure what he used for brushes. He painted this painting as a young man when he was 25 years old. But at the time, he was 25. He was newlywed of 2 years. He was living in Amsterdam, making a living as a painter. And he was apparently very, very smart, very bright. And he used very advanced techniques to get his painting uncannily perfect. And he also liked to have a bit of a joke, because that musical phrase there that we spoke about there at the bottom is a pun. One of the words in the title can be translated as measure. but also can be translated as the word temper. So as that which is out of temper, which we would say that is out of tune. It's a pun on the word temperance. To be out of temper or to be out of tune is to be intemperate. So if you sit down at the piano and play that tune, it would be, play the tune that's on there that he wrote, it would be out of tune. It uses an interval that is unpleasant to the human ear. That's actually has a term, and it's called the devil's music. And it's pretty clever little pun that he's done here.
12-tone music.
So he was a man, though, that didn't listen to the advice of his own painting. 2 years later, after this, his marriage fell apart. He fell into the same kind of excess as Governor Felix in his day. And he was eventually known as such a notoriously wicked person that even though he had this talent for painting, he was tried in Amsterdam and convicted for blasphemy, atheism, and frightful and pernicious lifestyles. He was almost executed for it, in fact. But at the last minute was saved by some very powerful friends. So they banished him. He ended up spending the rest of his life painting pornography for the extremely wealthy. All that talent, and he was dead at 55. And the interesting thing is we have descriptions in history of some of his pornographic paintings, but none of them survived. And in fact, none of his other paintings survived except this one, which is maybe God having a little joke.
Is that the whole painting?
That's the whole painting.
It's not just the centre of a...
No, because I think, if I remember the story, that this painting was lost. They knew that it existed, if I remember, but it was lost, and somebody found it attached, I think, if I remember, and I could be misremembering, but attached to the lid of a barrel. It was in somebody's house, and they had looked at the barrel lid and had this painting attached to it, and it was found and recovered. And it had survived. And so, what exists out of temper perishes in intemperate badness, is what he's saying here. And just compare that to what Paul says to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Every athlete exercises self-control or temperance in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wealth, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest, after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. And then Philippians 2. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by being obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Exodus 34:6 talks about the temperance of God. The Lord, the compassion and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. God is a God of temperance. God gave us temperance to be able to make decisions. And so it's important that with both justice and temperance, there's kind of like a funnel, you might say, because what you need is that next virtue to put them in check, and that's prudence. And prudence asks the next very important question of what do I do with justice and what do I do with temperance? How do I know to use them properly? And so this week, or let's see. So just a couple quick questions to talk about amongst yourselves for a minute. What's a couple items that you could share that could use a bit of temperance, if you want to share with each other? And what's something you could do to begin to temper them? So what's a couple items that you could share with each other that could use a bit of temperance? And what's something you could do to begin to temper them? And it might just be something very simple. I'm not asking you to deep dive. You don't have to share something deep, darkest secrets unless you want to. Confess your sins to one another so you may be healed.
So I used to smoke, and I switched